Has something happened that might bring the country to a new stage, to a new tipping point, to a new tomorrow?
I'm not sure. I think it largely depends on how those in power who have the influence and the resources to produce structural change respond to this crisis that we're in. I will say we have not seen this level, this number of uprisings across American cities for this sustained period of time, probably since the mid to late 1960s. So we are in a moment where there is potential for great structural reform, but it's left to be seen whether that actually occurs.
So Martin Luther King Martin Luther King himself said, riot is the language of the unheard. What goes through your mind when you hear those words and when you see these scenes and what happened to George Floyd and all the other names that came before him? What goes through your mind when you hear that sentence, riot is the language of the unheard?
What goes through my mind is clearly what he was attempting to address, which is that people have tried peaceful protests. People have tried to bring these issues to the national conscious. People have been asking for police reforms and for resources and investment in their communities. And it's largely fallen on deaf ears. And so what ends up happening is you get a spark like this. As your last guest said, police are the most visible agents of the state in Black communities, and at some point it becomes combustible. We don't pay attention, but we're certainly paying attention now. I guess
so let me ask you, because
go ahead. Go ahead.
You go ahead. The other thing, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, what other levers do the poorest Black communities have? They do vote, they do protest, but they do not run the institutions that can actually change their lives. And at some point, they have to use what they have.
So in a previous conversation this hour, I spoke to Martin Luther King III and to DeRay McKesson. And there was a difference of view as to actually what even violence meant. And DeRay was very clear that the Black community is not being violent, the police are, that property damage is property damage, but it's the police who are being violent against people's bodies. So I want to ask you, because I know you've talked about it, and there was this amazing piece of video over the weekend where two people were talking. One was a 16-year-old, the others were older, about the nature of what was unfolding and about what the young ones should do. And the older ones were saying, don't engage in violence. Let's just play it, and I want you to talk to me a little bit about it. So it's intense because it's exactly what's unfolding, the dilemma. What do we do? How do we do it? You sort of said both are right and wrong. Tell me about it.
I mean, what that clip is really showing is this sense of helplessness that we are a 13% minority in a majority white country. We are descendants of people who were enslaved in this country. And so ultimately, our protest is only as successful as we can convince white Americans to actually comply with the Constitution and treat Black Americans as full citizens. I think I would not describe looting as violence. Looting is property damage, but it is not violence. And I would actually like to go to Martin Luther King's own words. He wrote a letter to the American Psychological Association in September of 1967. And what he said is that looting comes from the most enraged and deprived Negro, and it allows them to take hold of consumer goods with the ease that a white man does by using his purse. Often the Negro does not even want what he takes. He wants the experience of taking. Negroes have committed crimes, but they are the derivative crimes, and they are born of the greater crimes of the white society. So when we ask Negroes to abide by the law, let us also demand that the white man abide by the law in the ghettos as well. So I think we need to have some perspective on what exactly we're seeing when we call that violence and looting.
I think it's It's so interesting to hear you say this, and it really made me sit up when DeRay said it, because this is how it's being framed. And I have to say that we are being, criticized by some very prominent members of the black community, from LeBron James to various people in Congress to all over, that we're focusing maybe on the wrong thing, that we go just to one area and not to the other area with our cameras and our lenses and our reporting. And it's really, really interesting to try to break it down. And I want to say, obviously, because you are the producer of the 1619 Project, 400 years since slavery in America, and you won the Pulitzer Prize for your work on that. And you've said, among other things, people who've been left out of the social contract find no need to adhere it. And then somebody sort of checked you on that and said, not left out, excluded from the social contract. And you kind of agreed. You agreed with being, term checked, so to speak, on that.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the thing. You are asking people whose communities have been looted for decades, who don't have proper schools, who don't have proper amenities, who have been, when we see someone killed by the police, that is the worst manifestation of police violence. But it doesn't get to the daily police violence that doesn't end in death, the daily degradations that Black Americans face, the fact that these communities have been preyed upon by predatory lenders. It goes on. And so when we think about how someone taking an act to take something from some big box name store, it is symbolic. That one pair of shoes that you've stolen from, Foot Locker is not going to change your life, but it is a symbolic taking. And so when we think about what the social contract was and who created it, it is that if you follow the rules, if you do the right things, then you will be able to access an equal society. And that has never been true for Black Americans, and particularly for the lowest income, most segregated Black Americans. So you cannot regularly not include them in the social contract, regularly violate the promises that this country makes to Americans, and then at this moment in time say, well, you should abide by the laws and the rules of our country because that's the right thing to do. There's no reason to expect that people who have regularly been left out will comply with this right now.
And so building on that, back in 2016, you wrote an essay called The Grief That White Americans Can't Share, 4 years ago. What is that grief?
We in this country, white Americans are raised to think of themselves as individuals, and they have been allowed for 400 years to be individuals. But Black people are a collective. We are a collective because by virtue of being assigned the race of Black, what we were and were not able to do legally, what circumstances we would live in, what schools we could go to, what neighborhoods we could live in, what jobs we could have, we're all constrained by our membership in a race. And to this day, we see incidents. It doesn't matter how much education you have. It doesn't matter what type of job you have. You are treated, quote unquote, as a Black person in this country, which means your rights can be violated at any moment. And so we see this as a collective pain. These are not individual incidents of rogue cops. This is a continuing pattern of violence against Black Americans. And even though I don't know George Floyd, he's like a family member. I know that what happened to him could happen to my uncle. It could happen to my cousin. And that is the grief, I think, that is very difficult for white Americans to feel. Maybe they have felt it in incidents like 9/11, where there was this kind of collective grieving. But that is our regular experience. That collective grieving for the desecration of Black life is a regular daily experience for Black people in this country.
It's just so important to hear from you and this whole hour hearing about what's happening and what needs to happen in the future. Nikole Hannah-Jones, thank you so much for being with us.